Good morning. It was a pleasure to be here in another week of talking to a specialist. And in this morning, we have the presence of Professor Kirk Klasing. Kirk, it's a pleasure to have you here in these discussions. And for me, it's always an honor to talk to you because I always learn a lot. And thank you so much to be here. Good morning.
Oh, good morning. Thanks for the invitation.
So, Kirk, this morning we tried to discuss a little bit about inflammation. So I remember when I was like a student in Brazil many years ago, and I read your papers about how the inflammations is a cost for the animal. I think you are the first person to start to see as a nutritionist that we should look at the inflammation as a cost. Since your first studies in that up to date, how is your overview about inflammation and the cost of it for the animal?
Yeah, my overview is that when I first started working on inflammation, I was looking at very acute systemic inflammation, which is probably not a major problem in the industry, but it was a good way to start off because the response is very large and we can measure things pretty easily. I think the evolution that's happened at least in my research, is moving on to more chronic low-grade inflammation and looking at the cost of that. And from my point of view, and then that inflammation can be systemic or it can be in the intestines. And so we've tried to work on both systemic and intestinal models. The costs are not that much different depending upon whether the inflammation is in the intestines or elsewhere. It's just the severity of the inflammation is typically lower in the intestine, but for the same amount of inflammation, the costs are about the same. From a practical point of view, I think intestinal inflammation is more commonly a chronic problem because it can affect the entire flock for its entire life. And when I first started in this area, especially when I started looking at intestinal inflammation, my goal was to understand antibiotics and how they reduced intestinal inflammation and how that might be related to the growth, increase in growth and feed efficiency that's commonly seen in antibiotics. And my general conclusion was I felt it was the primary reason that antibiotics increased growth and feed efficiency was because it decreased intestinal inflammation. And I still believe that. There's some who disagree with me, but I'm still in that camp. I think all the signs point towards a decrease in intestinal inflammation with antibiotics. Some people say it may be a direct effect of the antibiotics as an anti-inflammatory actions of antibiotics directly on the intestinal cells. My thinking has always been that it's an effect on the population on the microbiota and a decrease in inflammatory components of the microbiota. That's not really been separated out yet, but it's an area that several people are working on right now. So in general, to answer your question, philosophically, I've gone from looking at more basic the understanding of how inflammation causes metabolic changes and decreased growth. From a truly mechanistic point of view, we were trying to purify interleukin-1 before anybody discovered interleukin-1. And so it was a very mechanistic type of work, very academic, but I think it's evolved into very applied and helpful work for nutritionists.
Yes, I agree with you. In fact, I did some research when I apply like histopathology with the system that I put ice inside. And I published in the Poultry Science just showing that the antibiotic like erythromycin really works reducing the inflammation. This was correlated to feed conversion and body weight gain, the improvement. Mm-hmm. So I also believe that, but I'm really not sure about even if it's affected directly in microbiota or the cells, because the study of Newwood, it was about macrophage reducing, but it was in vitro. And I'm not sure that this is really happens when you have in vivo, but it's evidence that this is could happen anyway, right?
Right.
So
yeah, I'm surprised he hasn't. I'm surprised that Newell's not gone on and done the in vivo experiments, or somebody. I haven't seen anybody do that research yet. So
yes, another day I was talking with here in the same discussions with Michael Good, and we talk about the possibility that this chronic inflammation in the gut intestine of the broilers that happens, and it's very easy to show it with the age of the animal. You have this chronic inflammation happens as it happens in humans in gut health problems like Crohn's disease and this kind of things is very similar. And he has a theory that maybe these chronic inflammations could also maintain some mediators that could cause or be part of the problems in the breast muscles, like wood breast and this kind of things. What is your opinion about that?
Well, we've characterized a lot of changes in muscle growth and connective tissue coordinated growth with systemic inflammation, and then when we started doing the intestinal inflammation, we got very similar effects. So I don't think it really matters where the inflammation is. You still see some of these changes in systemic muscle metabolism, muscle growth, and so although I haven't actually looked into that specific syndrome, I think it's quite possible that would be the case. We know in human inflammatory diseases, there's a lot of muscle implications too, like Crohn's disease. So it makes sense to me.
When you talk about, you always you mention systemic and intestinal inflammation, but when you talk about nutrition specifically, do you think that still the systemic inflammations plays an important role, or the chronic inflammation in the gut is really what matters?
So to answer that question, we've run experiments where we look at the digestibility of various components of the feed, and we started doing that with systemic inflammation, where we inject things in the lymphatics or into the blood, and we characterized changes in fat absorption and amino acid absorption and trace mineral absorption. Then when we repeated that with intestinal inflammation, and we got almost identical results. So the systemic inflammation causes changes in absorption, very similar to intestinal inflammation. So to me, it's that there are obviously cytokines and hormones that are mediating this change in digestibility of the feed. And to me, it doesn't matter whether it's in the intestine or systemic. You get the same changes.
This is interesting because one of our guests that registered sent a question before. And thank you for all that register and send your questions. This is very helpful for us to follow up. And they just ask us about like the vaccine against bronchitis, against Gumboro disease. So what you're saying is that after we have a vaccination or a challenge with this, it's also will affect the digestibility and how the animal absorb the nutrients, right?
That's right. Yeah, because to get a good lasting immune response, you have to have some inflammation. It's not nearly as much inflammation as you might have with an infectious disease challenge, but there is some there. I think Mark Cook wrote a few papers on this 15, 20 years ago, itemizing the amount of decrease in growth that happened after a series of vaccinations in broiler chickens. And he also looked at ducks. The ducks were affected a lot more than broiler chickens.
Yes, because I think the inflammation for these white animals like ducks and turkeys is a little bit different, like we have in broilers, right?
Yeah, and in broilers, that in fact the amount of decrease in growth and feed efficiency and digestibility in a modern broiler is less than the broilers when I started doing my research on this back in the 1970s. And part of that's because I worked with the genetic companies to decrease the response, to decrease the damage done by inflammation. So that they've actually done breeding selection to minimize that decreased growth and feed efficiency. They've actually looked at food intake. They give a challenge, and they've selected for broilers that do not decrease their food intake as much as others. So the broilers are now more impervious to those problems than they were 30 to 40 years ago. But they still have problems.
When you think, I know that you are a very active member of NRC and are helping and are part of the committee that are doing the new NRC. Without your research and your knowledge about the requirements of inflammation, the cost of the inflammation, there is any, I know that you cannot open, but there is any discussions or any possibility that we should expect changes in terms of requirements when you have vaccinate birds or no vaccinate birds? There is some discussions that a table could happen that we have like for vaccinated or non-vaccinated birds, and I mean.
Well, what we're working on is to have, we're going to have a chapter on immunological stress that originates from the immune response, and give sort of an overview of some of the nutritional implications of that. But I don't think that there's enough data to actually come up with true nutritional requirement changes in a practical situation. I mean, our intent is to make sure that people understand there's a problem, and these are the signs and what you should be looking for. But from a quantitative point of view, I think the research is just not quite there to do as much as you would like to see, unfortunately.
Yes, I was having these discussions with Doug Over, and he told me the same. He said, well, the NRC just follow up what we have published. And maybe it's good for people that is listening to us now that they need to put more effort and publish research that really make the relationship of the cost of the immunity in vaccinate, no vaccinate. Even when I review paper, I always asking if it's vaccinated, non-vaccinated, but I think that is still, especially for nutritionists, for them understand the importance of to put in each time he published something that the animal have been vaccinated and what vaccine they use, because for me this makes a lot of difference, especially when you're talking about requirements, right?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about requirements, I receive as a professor in the past, but also today in the R&D when I'm developing new products, and from customers that always say, well, if your product shows that they have an effect on gut health, and we are able to show it by many assessments that could be histology, could be gene expressions, or many different kind of assessment, we show that the product works. Some people said, well, so can I, as a nutritionist, put a matrix for this kind of additive? Can I think that I can have a different diet because I put this additive, then I can have it as a compensator and reduce the cost? How is your view for this?
Yeah, I've gotten this question a number of times myself, and my response is that to some extent you have to think of if a product reduces inflammation and it's improving growth and feed efficiency, you kind of have to think about it like you think about antibiotics. You know, antibiotics are improving the health of the intestine and permitting them to grow at more of their genetic potential. Now, some portion of that is an increase in feed efficiency, and that's, in my mind, is due to two things. One is due to they're being more efficient because they're using less of the nutrients for the immune response and for supporting the inflammation. So I think of that as it's preventing a diversion of nutrients away from our intended use, which is growth, basically. So that's adding to the feed efficiency. Additionally, it's preventing a decrease in absorption of some nutrients. And in my research, the nutrients that are most affected is fat, so dietary fat and fat-soluble vitamins. And then some of the trace minerals are hit pretty hard too. Carbohydrates, we really don't see a problem with those. And so, in a typical broiler diet, when you think about energy digestibility, I think the carbohydrate digestibility is not really changing much, but the fat is. And in a typical broiler diet, if the fat's providing 20% of the energy, and we find in a moderately severe inflammation, the fat absorption goes down about 20%. So if it's, so if you do 20% times 20%, you've got 4% decrease in energy there. Some of the amino acids are also decreased in absorption. We see both methionine and cysteine are decreased. Lysine not. We've looked at that several times. But the decrease for methionine is somewhere around 8% or so. So that so now, if you can improve the absorption of those nutrients and simultaneously get more of those nutrients going to muscle and bone and less of it going to the liver for the acute phase response and to the B cells and T cells and macrophages and all those things. Overall, we're talking around, in general, 10% increase in use of nutrients in general. So those are some sort of matrix numbers I would put in. Now, I don't think people do that for antibiotics, but many of the products that are being developed have antibiotic-like effects. They're having an end result that's pretty similar to what antibiotics are doing. People use antibiotics faithfully, or they did for a long time when it's profitable, without doing change in matrices. But this whole idea of matrices really wasn't around when people were starting to use antibiotics. But so again, I think 10% for most nutrients is kind of where I feel comfortable with an increase in their use. If there is inflammation going on, which is not always going to be happening. Just like with antibiotics, you don't always need antibiotics, but you do often enough that it's still quite useful.
So if you are thinking about matrix, you basically talk about fat and methionine, or what will be exactly the nutrients that you put more effort in the matrix?
Well, the ones that are affected most is fat and fat-soluble vitamins. So carotenoids, for example, lutein absorption goes down by more than 50% with inflammation. And again, it doesn't matter if it's systemic or intestinal, it goes down, and that's why birds aren't as yellow. And with laying hens too, their yolks are not as yellow. We've done that experiment many times. So for something like lutein, I'd put in my matrix value of something closer to 50%. For fat, we get a decrease in absorption of fat of about 20%. And again, with methionine and cysteine, it's closer to 8 or so percent. And then with zinc and iron, iron goes down to about 40%. And this has been shown in humans and rats and mice. The iron has really hit hard. And zinc's around 10 or 15% too. So, the dollar value for a change in iron absorption is probably not very high. And even zinc is pretty cheap too. But, there's a little bit there. It's the energy that's really, I think, the most important part, and the amino acids too. So I think that's the advantage of these newer products.
So I think that this approach is something that really nutritionists and the pathologists need to work more closely, right, to find these real values and to have more publications in that for the future. In URC, we have more this approach, because another discussions about chronic inflammation is high related to the fact that you have like a big amount of feed inside the intestinal tract that is not completely digested, and this is maintained. Mm-hmm. It's like a full cycle that you have, like start an inflammation for another reason, but then you reduce the absorptions of nutrients, and because you have this excess of nutrients, you have more chronic inflammation. Then will be a cycle that never ends up to the end of broilers. And it's not just about the cost of inflammation, but the cost of inflammations, the cost of diet, and the impact on the environment. So as to be for sustainability, I think all that we can adjust in terms of diet, taking account the inflammation process is important. You bring a very good information here about the fat, the methionine and lutein. So my question is like, it's possible to do this matrix. We need to work more in this matrix for each situation, for each additive that we are using. And in this way, we expect even to have better performance than we have. We've just put the additive on top. This is what. Yes.
Could be. I mean, that's the type of research that's needed. And one other thing that you sort of triggered in my memory on is that we've also looked at moisture, so wet litter moisture, and with the gut inflammation, we get quite a bit more litter moisture, which results in a lot of additional foot pad problems and breast lesions and things like that. So there's additional value beyond just the nutritional side. There's management implications too. Whenever wet litter is a problem, we know, well, we certainly know it's always a problem if you got coccidiosis or Clostridia, and so that's a case of intestinal inflammation.
It's very interesting, and I also want to address here why we have maybe some of people that are listening us want to understand why we have this kind of cost of immune response. So I'm wondering, for example, for the fat, why do you think that we have this impact and this stability of fat? Is because of the inflammation that oxidates the fat? How is your vision, how the inflammation affected the digestibility of fat, specifically fat that is the highest that you mentioned here?
Actually, the highest is iron. And that
yes,
one,
of course, sorry. It's iron, but iron, we understand, is basically because of the bacteria also use a lot of iron, right?
That's right. Right. So the iron is well understood. It's been well understood for 50 years. The bacteria need a lot of iron, and part of the immune response is to take iron away from pathogens. And so the iron absorption is completely understandable. I've been troubled about your question, why does this happen? In a time when you actually need more nutrients, not less, you decrease nutrient absorption. And I actually had a graduate student come up with an idea a couple of years ago that I thought was crazy. And then the more I thought about it, the more I think he's right. And that is the liver normally is involved in, homeostasis and nutrient homeostasis. It takes up the lipids, it takes up the amino acids, it repackages them, sends them back out, all that sort of stuff. And that's one of its major functions. In a healthy state, it's doing that. The animal's eating a lot, and the liver's spending all of its time and resources to aid the dispersion of nutrients for growth. But when inflammation occurs, the liver changes its function considerably. Now it's producing a lot of protective proteins. It produces they're called acute phase proteins, but they're actually produced in a large amount during chronic inflammation continuously. So now the liver is diverted, let's say 30% of its resources, its ability to synthesize proteins and do things, to another function. So consequently, it can't do both functions infinitely. And the liver actually expands in size. It expands in chronic inflammation. It gets about 5 to 10% bigger. Every other tissue grows slower except for the liver and immune tissues. It's getting bigger because it's trying to do two jobs at once. But there's a limit to what it can do that. And so we find that during this chronic inflammation, we get a buildup of lipids in the blood. You can see more fat in the blood. We get some derangements in amino acid metabolism. We see methionine is not converted to cysteine as well. So the liver's giving up some of its functions that normally are important for growth. So one way to prevent there being problems with this liver bottleneck is to decrease some of the nutrients that are difficult to process from coming in, like fat. I mean, fat is a very challenging nutrient to utilize. It, you know, comes into the, and chickens into the portal vein, goes to the liver repackages it as VLDL, and when that becomes disturbed, fat starts building up in the liver and the hepatocytes, and as well as the blood, and we see that. And so I think it's a protective response to the liver having to do two things at once and not doing either one as well, unless it can get rid of some of the problems. So that's my theory. The data is circumstantial. You know, the data is that we do see a larger liver, we see a fattier liver, we see disturbances in amino acid metabolism, we see some of the things that liver would normally be doing are not getting done, like making cysteine from methionine. So that's my graduate student's harebrained idea that I'm promoting.
Very interesting. So you are saying that because to protect the liver to be more fat, like to have a steatosis, exactly. You have some mechanism of defense that avoid to have these absorptions. I never thought about that. I always think about this inflammation and oxidations that could happen in the intestine, and this is avoid absorptions. Interesting, very interesting. You know, I have a professor here in the University of Montreal, Alexander Tiburu, and he does some in vitro studies with Salmonella, and he saw that, for example, and in vivo as well, when they have like high levels of methionine in diet, they have more growing of Salmonella and Campylobacter. So the way we are talking here, I'm thinking that also we need to think about nutrition as a way, like nutritionists need to also think nutrition not more like in the past, just to have the requirements, nutrients that the animal needs in the conditions that we do the studies, that is completely clean, no nothing. But start to also using the nutrition as to modulate even for foodborne disease as Campylobacter and Salmonella. And you were saying here as well that methionine and cysteine is like 8%. You can work in 8% of reductions when you have this inflammation control. So at the end, can we conclude that really we need to work more in the data of nutrition for digestibility? What's the tool that you recommend a nutritionist? Like there is a lot of students and professors that are listening us today. What is your recommendation in terms of methodology for us to follow up your ideas?
Yeah, the model system I do. So first of all, the digestibility is pretty well established how to do that. You know, we do the ileal digestibility. We do it in young growing broiler chicks, usually about when they're about 16 days of age or so. And we induce inflammation, and we just kill the birds and look at ileal digestibility with a marker. Pretty straightforward, no rocket science. The difficult thing is to get repeatable intestinal inflammation. And I've worked on that problem for a long time. The model that we commonly use is an overdose of coccidia. And then we also oftentimes use a diet that has some rye in it, which helps, makes more viscosity problems, and it typically gets more Clostridia going. And it results in our typical model most of the time, not every experiment, but most of the time, it results in about a 10 to 15% decrease in growth, especially when the birds are young. They start to come back after when they get a little older, but when they're young. So that's our model system most of the time. And then we measure digestibility as they're going through this intestinal inflammation. And we measure we look at lesion scores along the intestines and things like that. And typically we see them. They're not severe, but they're there. So that's a model. I've been trying to find a model system that is chronic inflammation that doesn't require living organisms. Yes, because every time you bring living organisms into the picture, it's extremely variable. You don't get the same results every time. And there's a dextran sulfate model that's used a lot in mice, and it's been used in pigs. And it's been used a little bit in broilers. It works, but the problem is most of the inflammation's in the ceca, which is not typically where we have that problem. There's another model that's used in mice that we're now doing some experimentation with, and that's an indomethacin model. And it's a model they use for Crohn's disease. In mice, it causes massive inflammation in the large intestine, but it also causes inflammation in the ileum. Well, broilers don't have a large intestine, so we've already done some preliminary experiments, and it's giving us some pretty good results with pretty good inflammation in the ileum without any in the ceca, and a little bit of the large intestine they have. So that might have some utility where we can have a reproducible model that gives a chronic inflammation. In this case, it goes on for about 7 days, where then you can do nutritional sorts of things. There are many models where you can have a sudden inflammation and then it goes away in 24 hours. And it's really difficult to do nutrition in those situations. Yes. Like, for example, the systemic LPS model. It's kind of hard to do much nutrition in a very transient model like that.
No, we are almost at the end of the conversation, but before we finalize, I have basically 2 questions for you. One is like, I have been in field for a while, and I have seen, for example, in countries that they use the starving because of high altitude, you know. In fact, when you compare the performance of these animals with the performance of animals that doesn't have starving in another regions, we really don't see difference in them. Like, you do the starving, but at the end, the animal is still doing well. So one question that I have is like, it could be like a restriction feed program as we have in breeders, something that we should think, or is better to think in the way to have a matrix and to adjust the matrix and still have ad libitum? Because in humans, like myself included, I do starving because I read a lot of papers that show the benefits of it for health, not just because of the diet, but not for diet, but for really have these benefits that they describe. And I feel it. I should include the test with myself, like before and after, and blood test and everything. So how are your thoughts about that?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about it. There is a lot of old literature on some of these, comparing ad libitum consumption versus meal feeding in birds. When I say old, it was done mostly in the 1960s. But they showed better efficiency when they made the broiler chickens do meal eating instead of ad libitum. So they give them basically 3 or 4 meals a day or 2 meals a day, and they showed better results. Now that was so long ago, I don't know if it's still relevant because the bird has changed so much. But then it was Mel Nessheim who at Cornell did a lot of that work, and they saw that it was just the birds are just more efficient when they fed meals instead of a little bit all day long type. Or actually, I think they were doing a 23-hour lighting program, so they were eating most of the day. So, and then there's been work done on rats too, showing similar things and mechanistically showing that there's less cost of making the digestive enzymes and keeping the epithelial cells all active all the time. That there's some savings of nutrients by having those more punctuated meals and having ad libitum consumption. So I think there's certainly a possibility that that's something we should look at again.
Start to look. So as a final message, Kirk, I would like to ask you, How do you feel that is the future of animal productions when you think about sustainability in, like, let's think in a dream world? What as research in the animal production area should put more or effort to be like a human being, like Earth sits in, like the planet? How can we contribute to maintain animal production sustainable and don't have so big impact in the environment and still have all the people eating well?
Well, I think, you know, health of the bird is critical for that. And I think we do a pretty good job with those infectious organisms that can cause major problems, Merrick's disease, infectious bronchitis, all those types of things that we can vaccinate against. And, you know, that's going to be an ongoing thing. And those particular, what I call acute infection types of things that result in death, we're going to always, that's always going to be a challenge, but we're going to be able to stay ahead of it like we always have, simply by good veterinary practices and all. To me, it's those really low grade, I call them childhood diseases, that broilers go through. They're getting a whole series of infections from commensal microflora that are typically not thought of as pathogens, but they can enter into a pathogenic phenotype and cause transient infections. The immune system responds, knocks them back. They're never a problem again, but it has to keep going through this. And so the chicken is just continually going through these childhood diseases, one and after, you know, over and over and over again. And that's where I think a lot of the cost is. And that's where I think that the health professionals, the veterinarians who are really in charge of you know, the prevention of these types of diseases, has to work with the nutritionist to figure out ways to get rid of these more subtle, but still damaging challenges that happen from commensal microflora that you're never going to get rid of. They're always going to be there. And so it's going to be a challenging approach. But I think now with the new ability to examine microbiota composition by, you know, genetic phenotyping the microbiota, and then combining that with nutrition and combining it with our knowledge of intestinal defenses, we should be able to get some major steps forwards to improve the intestinal health of the chicken, which is then going to result in better environmental aspects, because those extra nutrients are going out or causing environmental problems. Decrease in efficiency causes environmental problems. So to me, that's the opportunity. And I think it's going to be more challenging than simpler things like Merrick's disease. and I'm not saying they were simple, but they were solved in a few years. And
like a coronavirus, they should be solved. Like
exactly, right. You throw a bunch at it, and you get it solved. But so far we've always used crutches like antibiotics to solve this problem, and they're not the perfect crutch, but they help. So we need more and more of these crutches, and companies like yours are developing them. But we also need to understand the basic interactions between the diet and the immune system and the microflora, and why these challenges keep happening, and can we prevent them from happening better.
So basically gut health is still on high line in your view of how nutritionists and pathologists should work together to improve animal production. Especially in broilers, because they're babies their entire life. So, you know, it's a challenging situation. They get older, it's not so bad. Just like with humans, you stop having all these problems when you get to about 3 or 4. So yeah, very good vision about the broilers be baby all life long up to the end. So do you have any final message for all these students, professors, and professionals that have been with us all this morning, listening to you? You have something to tell them? Well, I mean, just from a broad painted stroke, it's important to interact with people outside your field. We tend to be in silos. We tend to be a nutritionist, or we tend to be a pathologist, or we tend to be a management person, but they're all
completely intertwined. And if the nutrition doesn't do that, nutritionist is screwing up, it also affects the veterinarian who's in charge of health and vaccination, and vice versa. if the veterinarian is not getting things done right, you're going to have nutritional changes. And so I really think it takes getting out of silos sometimes to fix some of these problems.
Very good. I lately I'm reading a lot about what Lynn Morigulis published about synergism, and all the time I symbiosis. All the time I saw that the symbiosis between human beings is very important as well. Like it's important that we connect each other with our knowledge, and each one is able to provide with some informations that will help another people, and this is what makes the society be better, and we really grow as human beings. So, Professor, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. It's you know that it's always been nice. I always read your paper, and it's always a learning process when I be in touch with you. Thank you so much for your time in this morning. Wake up early at 7, right? 6:30 in California. Thank you so much, and I hope you have more discussions about that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and that was a fun discussion, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, it was very good. So for everybody that's follow us, we tomorrow have another discussions. I have a professor from Washington State University, and we talk about out of box of Salmonella, not the common Salmonella view, but basically, Kirk, for you to know, we talk about the requirements of Salmonellas to grow. And exactly how we can manipulate maybe with some amino acids, some special requirements that could affect the Salmonella growth, and how can nutrition play also a role in control of Salmonella. And I wait all of you tomorrow in my talk here with Professor Shad Devendra. Thank you so much, Kirk, and thank you to all of you at home, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.